I am so happy that we are back here on Be Well Together because we know now more than ever, we need to be well. We need to build resilience and we need to keep ourselves physically and mentally healthy so that we can continue to fight for the changes in the US and all around the world. So thank you for joining us again this morning. Today's guest is no stranger to driving change for racial injustice and how it has really evolved over recent modern history. She has led a career dedicated to social movements, including wellness and access to healthy food. So I am really, really happy to introduce this morning Dr. Marcia Chatelain. She is a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor. That is so hard to say, and I've been practicing it all morning. Marcia, Provost's Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. She is previously a Reach for Excellent Assistant Professor at Honors in African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. And she is a scholar and a speaker and a strategist and an author of African American life and culture. So her first book was South Side Girls, which was it reimagined the exodus of Black Southerners to urban North from the perspective of girls and teenage women. Her latest book, which I'm sort of becoming obsessed with, is called Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. And this examines the intersection of the post-1968 civil rights struggle and the rise of the fast food industry. So we are just delighted to have you with us today, Marcia. I have just been so intrigued in all the research I've been doing on your latest book, and I'm very eager for you to share this narrative with our Be Well Together audience. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone in Salesforce. It is a real pleasure to be here to talk about wellness as it relates to the study of history. We know that current events have made a lot of us very uneasy and sometimes feeling helpless to make a change. But one of the things that I have found for my own personal wellness in regards to wanting to know what I can do to be an advocate is through the study of history. So today I'm going to talk about my new book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, through the lens of what it teaches us, not only about what we eat and the choices we get to make about food, but the ways that they're connected to politics, as well as a larger vision of what communities need after a crisis. So my book is an examination of the backstory of images like this. Many of us are familiar of how news media represents the problems of obesity and African American communities. Sometimes we don't even see full pictures of people's bodies. We see them cut off and they represent this sense of crisis. We also know with the current crisis of COVID-19, pre-existing health conditions have exacerbated the health outcomes of African Americans who are fighting the virus. And so when I see articles like this, when I see news stories like this, I always say, but do we think about how we got here? How did we create a society in which African Americans and other communities of color find themselves in neighborhoods without access to grocery stores, a hyper concentration of fast food outlets, and then having to bear the weight of the consequences, not only of diets that are filled with foods that we've decided are not nutritious, but also to be in a position to work in industries that often pay very low wages. And so in writing Franchise, I wanted to write the social history of the obesity crisis. And instead of scrutinizing the choices people make in what they eat, I want to think about the societal investments that got us here. So you may be familiar with this guy. For those of you who are of a certain age, he was president of the United States once. His name is Bill Clinton. And one of the enduring images of the Clinton campaign was the president of the United States eating fast food. And this became fodder for shows like Saturday Night Live. But one of the things I thought was really interesting when I researched Bill Clinton's relationship to fast food was this quote from Toni Morrison, which appeared in the Talk of the Town section of The New Yorker. And it's about this quote that is attributed to her, but often misunderstood. when she calls Clinton the first Black president. And what she was talking about was the fact that Clinton had been pursued in her mind relentlessly by Congress during his impeachment trials. But the way she describes him as Black includes these descriptions that are tied to stereotypes. Single parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's and junk food loving boy from Arkansas. And when I read this article and I thought about the representation of the obesity crisis, I started to think, well, how did we get here? How did McDonald's become Black, and how did fast food become so prevalent in Black communities? And so moving from Clinton, I also thought of images like this from the news media. This is from the Ferguson uprising in 2014, after Officer Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown. And one of the images you saw often, if you watched a lot of cable news like I did, was the McDonald's in Ferguson, Missouri as a central feature of the drama, in which you saw the forces of activists as well as police coming together in these confrontations. And again, McDonald's and civil unrest has had a long history in the United States. In fact, it was after Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, that caused this transformation of the fast food industry, in which white franchise owners of McDonald's restaurants no longer wanted to do businesses that were at the center of these uprisings. And so McDonald's allowed them to move their businesses to the suburbs, and in their place became African-American franchises. And this business opportunity not only had McDonald's interacting with African-American consumers for the first time, but it showed that the fast food industry that if you go into neighborhoods that had been eviscerated by social unrest, had fewer and fewer options in the marketplace, you could make a lot of money. And in that process, McDonald's grafted itself onto a long history of civil rights struggles. In the United States, we have about 250,000 fast food restaurants. And although the franchise model is seen throughout industries, whether it's where you get your oil changed or the hotel you stay in, we often associate franchising with fast food. And the franchising model is simple. You get a blueprint from a parent corporation, and then the franchisee is responsible for setting forth a business in a local community. Franchising, however, can be incredibly challenging for people who do not have lots of access to capital. And in the late 1960s, very few African Americans who wanted a business opportunity were able to just go into a bank and get a loan. But through this franchise initiative, they were able to use the weight and the financial resources of established franchises, as well as a series of programs underwritten by the federal government to allow for more African Americans in the franchise sector. And so McDonald's, a brand that had long been associated with the Americana of the 1950s, which had grown up in mostly white suburbs throughout the 50s and the 60s, was now confronting the changes of the civil rights movement. And so after 1960 and the quest to integrate restaurants and public accommodations that is seen in this iconic image from the Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in of 1960, you start to see a shift in the restaurant industry. What's curious about this is that very few people know that McDonald's was actually a target of the similar types of boycotts that we associated with brands that are no longer with us, like Woolworths or Rexall Drugs. In fact, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was at the forefront of trying to integrate McDonald's restaurants in the South. So as the social changes in public accommodations are happening in the civil rights movement, McDonald's is starting to understand something about the changing landscape of American business as well as Black consumer expectations. And so by the time we get to 1968, when Martin Luther King's assassination has inspired a great deal of grief and uprisings in American cities, the question of business becomes front and center on what to do to repair communities that had long been left behind. Signs like this, Soul Brother, were put in the windows of Black-owned businesses in hopes that it would safeguard against property destruction. We see very similar images today in cities across the country that are managing the tensions of unrest. And so those big signs that you see now that say Black-owned business, they also have a long history of trying to communicate the difference between themselves and outsider businesses that people may associate with the exploitation of local people. Why is this so important? Well, this moment in Memphis creates moments like this. In 1968, the first African-American franchised McDonald's opens in Chicago, and it is a restaurant that has been abandoned by a white franchise owner. And it becomes not just a symbol of a new business in a community, but perhaps the hope that by establishing businesses in African-American communities, African-Americans will experience something that white consumers had long experienced: comfort in patronizing a restaurant or a store without fear of discrimination, and with the sense that this will reinvest into their communities. So throughout the 1970s, articles like this appear in the African-American press, celebrating the entry of African-American franchise owners into the McDonald's system. Other fast food restaurants follow suit, and so Burger King, KFC, and the other major brands start recruiting African-American franchise owners. But it's not just about the food. Throughout the 1970s, groups like this one in Cleveland boycotted McDonald's, again, not because they were denied service, but because they started to make demands for ownership within the community. You also see moments like this. This is a protest in Portland, Oregon, where the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense protested McDonald's, not because they're bothered by McDonald's in their community, but they want McDonald's to start contributing to their free breakfast program for children. So by the mid-1970s, McDonald's has to understand itself in relationship to African-American communities. And this is no different than some of the ways that we understand social entrepreneurship, community relations, social philanthropy, business community partnerships. I argue that this experiment into African-American communities and the pushback, as well as the compromises that are being made about McDonald's, contributes to our landscape today of understanding business and social responsibility. And throughout the book, I talk about various moments of tension with the idea of fast food. In Portland and in Philadelphia, in the Ogons neighborhood, there are protests against McDonald's, as well as attempts on the part of African-American celebrities to compete against McDonald's, arguing we are an authentically Black-owned business. So Muhammad Ali, the boxer, starts his own burger company called Champ Burger. It does not succeed. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, starts a chain of fried chicken restaurants that look like churches it's called Glory Fried Chicken. And so all of these attempts to what I call bending the golden arches, at the center of it is this question: is buying Black, is having a Black-owned business critical for the survival and the growth of African-American communities? And again, these are the same questions that are being asked today. Throughout my book, I talk about the cultural work of the fast food industry. It's not just about the food. It's about advertising that connects to African-American consumers, like these from the iconic Burrell Communications Company based out of Chicago, which was really the leader in marketing to African-Americans. It's the fact that African-American franchise owners helped underwrite the celebration of the Martin Luther King holiday, which didn't become a federal holiday until 1983. It's about the sponsorship of gospel music tours and double Dutch leagues and All-American basketball. And so I present these ideas so that when we talk about food justice, we often talk about people, again, making choices about what they eat, but rarely do we understand that in situations where there are very few or limited resources, the connections that people make to companies are also about this critical cultural work. So if you want people to stop eating French fries and start eating kale, you have to understand that the fast food industry has an impact in the totality of communities, and that's why sometimes these arguments are hard to make. As the story concludes into the 1980s, I talk about the partnerships between the Black McDonald's Operators Association and civil rights organization like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Urban League, two charities that McDonald's recently announced that they'll be donating to. But they've also had a long relationship with these civil rights organizations as they facilitated partnerships in order to open more of these restaurants in African-American communities. And so you really see the catch-22 that leaders found themselves in welcoming the fast food industry and understanding the health consequences. And finally, my story kind of ends where my inquiry began. And this is a picture of a McDonald's in Los Angeles during the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings. And after that week of turmoil concluded in Los Angeles, McDonald's sent a press release that argued that the reason why it was not a target of any property damage during that week was because of this long relationship it had in African American communities. And we understand when we take a full historical view of these pictures, the complications. And so as our former First Lady wanted young people to move and make discerning nutritional choices, as we see the continued fight for better wages and better working conditions, especially as the fast food industry has become among the front line in the response to COVID, we have to ask ourselves critical questions about how we understand business as delivering a set of options in communities, as well as the complicated ways when communities look to business to nourish it, some of the things that we miss. And so I'm looking forward to your questions and comments about this very complicated history, but I always return to something that is important to me. The more and more we're able to interrogate history and be critical of the processes that perhaps limit other people's choices, we become more empathetic and sympathetic to the conditions in which people are forced to live under, and we become more patient and generous with ourselves as we struggle to make a change. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I love this. I love this. And I think that one of the reasons that I'm just so intrigued by this is it just feels like it's like right under our noses, like, I mean, there's a McDonald's everywhere. And, your story is so compelling around the opportunity and the hope and the promise and the rebuilding of communities that this was supposed to provide. And, a link to just, decades of terrible health. And it's so complex. It's so complex.
And I think what it allows us to do, if we take it from that perspective, is that we understand that when people are making choices and we want them to change their choices, we always have to remember the context in which those choices were created. And we also have to recognize that any type of issue that we are confronted with today is going to require a lot of steps in the beginning. So had the response after 1968 be, okay, businesses are important, but let's look at people's health. Let's look at people's
right.
Let's look at the minimum wage in America. What are the other ways that we can rebuild communities? Because what I am concerned about now is that after this moment becomes quieter, and after we have to draft legislation and we put resources in, what kind of resources will communities that have been starved for a very long time, what will they get? What will be their options? And can we imagine opportunities that don't require so many compromises?
Absolutely. And I mean, that kind of touches on something that I'm feeling, because I fear for that too. I fear for, there's a moment, there's a movement that is happening now. And what happens when it quiets down? Mm-hmm. And as an ally, as I'm trying to figure out how to best invest my energies and my time and my resources, knowing something is so complex like this, and you've spent a good deal of time studying this, I'm curious from your perspective, like, where's the best place to start? Is it with health? Is it with politics? Is it with economics? Is it with social injustices? Like, where do we start? Because it's not a quick fix, but you want to feel like, I think, as you're trying to get involved, that you're making impact, and that you're grabbing others with you on this movement, and that you're seeing change or feeling you're a part of something better. And I just feel very overwhelmed in knowing, like, where?
So I often tell people, start with history, because you'll know the good ideas and the bad ideas. Mm-hmm. Because we unfortunately live in a country where all our very good ideas, we never were patient enough or committed enough to see if they could flourish. School integration happened in a lot of cities. People did not sit and wait for it to flourish. The second that it started, it was derailed by legislation, derailed by Supreme Court cases. We had a time where we were going to do universal childcare in this country. And then a political force came and said, no, 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 that's socialism, that's communism. And then it gets derailed. So when we look back, we have these incredible ideas that no one tried. You know, we had these really powerful community organizations in the 60s and 70s, and then someone said, okay, they're challenging too much, let's defund them, right? So I think what I always find solace is that people did come up with good ideas. They were imaginative, but what did it take for people to stay committed? They needed more information, they couldn't succumb to fear, and they really had to see that, okay, what's around the corner if we make these sacrifices? I mean, I think a pandemic, that experience of living through a pandemic, it chastens all of us. We don't know what we're made of until we're kind of, put to a moment of crisis. And I think that we can feel that on a policy level when we learn about these ideas that were never allowed to grow.
Yeah, so we've got to be patient, and we have to study, and we have to really keep investing long after the things start to quiet down. We have to keep going. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So for many of you many of you may not know, but we have, like many companies, we have amazing employee resource groups in our company. We call them equality groups, and Bold Force is the equality group for our Black community. And they've been doing amazing work in helping our company learn and grow together during this time. And so I thought it would be nice today to have a guest moderator. So I would like to welcome Ifosa Agbomo, who is our Bold Force Global Finance Chair. Ifosa, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Jody.
Great, welcome. So I think that you also had a couple of questions, and there may be questions coming in from chatter. So I invite you and welcome you to the Be Well Together stage to, you can grill Dr. Marcia a little bit.
All right, thank you. I think just kind of piggybacking off Jody's last question for Dr. Chatelain, many of these instances of institutionalized racism you outlined took place over the span of decades, and their impacts have clearly lasted generations. Do you see any progress in these injustices or steps in the right direction that are happening?
I'm always just so moved by people's willingness to stay committed, because I think that's what we need to see. Perseverance is a strong argument. And so, I like that people are doing history memes now. And one of the memes that's circulating is about how long the Montgomery bus boycott was. This is like a year of people not on the buses, people having to coordinate rides for each other, people having to get car insurance in different countries in order to kind of move forward. And so for me, we are persistent. We're built for persistence, but for those of us in positions of privilege, rarely is that tested. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that. And so I'm always moved by the fact that the conversation is so different. Since 2014, I remember when the idea of Black Lives Matter was so radicalized, and now people are understanding the depth and the substance of that statement. And so a lot of unlikely figures are saying, okay, I can kind of wrap my head around it. That takes time, but that only happened because the movement for Black lives has continued to grow and add more nuance and add more layers. Had the first time someone said, oh, Black Lives Matter, that's too much, I can't handle it, that people who were committed to the principles were like, okay, then we're just going to pack up our stuff, then we wouldn't be at this particular moment where people have a deep curiosity and desire to do more. So I'm always kind of just moved by how quickly we can change the discourse because of the persistence of people who know what's right in their gut and are willing to pivot in different ways to demonstrate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So persistence is key, I think, with everything that we do. I did want to ask a question from a former student of yours and current Salesforce employee, Ende. She said, I know you take great pride in having started the hashtag Ferguson syllabus, which was a way for educators to engage with their students on the topic of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. 6 years later, we are still fighting the same fight, but I think we can recognize that the protests are significantly different this time. The way the world has been engaging with our protests is unprecedented. What conversations would you hope to start this time around with your students, and what do you want us to know about how history will remember these events?
I think that what has happened over those 6 years and why I think it was so important, a lot of people didn't understand when they were presented with the idea that the movement for Black Lives wasn't about one organization with one leader, this kind of decentralized leadership structure. And a lot of people from the generation of the civil rights movement of the 1950s said, I don't get it. How can you not have one head and lots, a leadership cabinet? And what they were saying, which I think we're understanding now, is that leadership emerges from the community and from the people and the context in which they're working. So that the movement for Black Lives in Los Angeles, in Omaha, Nebraska, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Toronto looks different because people are identifying different needs in those places. And I think a lot of people didn't get what that could mean. And now we're seeing the power of it because we're also in a pandemic where one of the things I think is amazing is the rise of mutual aid societies. This is something from like the 18th century that local
talk about patience.
Yeah, like people are saying, wait a second, our local community knows that this is what we need. Local people are going to identify the problem, and they're going to define the solutions. And I think there's a new appreciation for that because we've seen the way it works. And so that I think is amazing. The second thing is that the movement for Black Lives really raised consciousness about police violence as well as racist civilian violence, which I think is important. It's the distinctions between what happened to Trayvon Martin versus what happened to George Floyd. But at the center of it, right, is this idea of violence and the value of human life. And I think that is such a central part of what we are seeing right now, where people are saying, I don't want to bear witness to this type of violence in a person's life. I don't need to know them. I don't need them to be perfect. I don't need them to be the person that I would want as my neighbor or my family, that if something is an injury to one of us, it's an injury to all of us. I think that has been a lot better now than I've seen in the past. And then the last thing I think is that what surfaced after Ferguson was a real consciousness raising on a national level about like the dynamics of policing, how it is also decentralized. It's also so local. Like people didn't understand that there's no kind of one set of rules that police follow. And that at the local level, when it was failing, people had a clearer sense of what to attack and then had a sense of what the federal government through the Department of Justice could do. It was an incredible civics lesson that I think people are now, in some of their critiques of reform versus defund or dismantle, they're able to have better conversations because of the civics lesson that they learned after Ferguson.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. So what I wanted to ask is, obviously the food industry has been hit really hard, not only with the pandemic, but over the last few weeks. And there's been increasing discussions around the topic of food deserts, especially in underserved communities. What would you want people to know about food deserts and how they can educate themselves on that?
So if you care about food justice, this is what I want you to understand. The first one is that the period of time I'm talking about, up into the present, the classification of fast food restaurants as small businesses for the purposes of access to capital is really, really important. Because if a fast food franchise is considered a small business and a grocery store isn't, the capacity for communities that are in rebuild mode to get a franchise versus a supermarket is vastly different. The second thing I want people to know is that fast food is sometimes the most rational, best choice for a person to make. If you want to live in a world where people are not consuming so much fast food and dealing with the health consequences, then you have to want to live in a world where people don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs. I grew up with a mom who worked 2 to 3 jobs. Eating fast food made perfect sense for her in her context. You get a lot of sugar, you get a fats, you get carbohydrates, you're going to your next job. Had my mom worked fewer jobs, she probably would have made more food at home. And the last thing is that when we are concerned about food deserts, or what we call food apartheid, we also have to understand the structural conditions that allow people to either keep food refrigerated and safe and healthy or not. So if you are concerned about whether or not people have good food to eat, the next question is, do they have enough electricity in their home for a refrigerator? Can they afford their electric bills? I'm from the Midwest. After a very cold winter, people's gas bills and their heating bills, once that gas is shut off, they can now not cook food. That's the question I want you to ask. I want you to ask who is supplying the food to your local school's cafeteria, whether or not you have a kid at that school. If that's an issue for you, you've got to attack it. You have to understand that none of us consumes anything in one context. And once you start asking all of the little questions about context, you realize how this is tied into economic justice and health justice. And then you find the place that really, really inspires you, and you work from that place.
You are a remarkable woman. Thank you
You're so
much. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us. I hope everyone goes out and gets this book. It's called Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. I am so eager to get my hands on this book, and I am so grateful for your time this morning. Thank you very, very much.
Be well, Salesforce. And if you want to continue the conversation, I spend way too much time on Twitter like most folks. So I'd love to hear your questions and your comments. Thank you so much.
That's great. Tell us what your Twitter handle is so we can follow you.
It's at Dr. M. Chatelain. So Dr. DRM and then my last name. And feel free to tweet a storm. I'm at home. I've got time.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. So glad that we're back together again. Be happy, be well. Bye-bye.